House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is refusing to cooperate with the Select Committee investigating the January 6th assault on the Capitol. The panel wants to know more about his conversations with former President Donald Trump on January 6th, but the top House Republican says he will not sit for an interview, calling the committee's probe illegitimate. During the riot last year, McCarthy joined CBS News and told Norah O'Donnell about talking to Trump.
Have you spoken with the president and asked him to perhaps come to the Capitol and tell the supporters it's time to leave?
I've spoken to the president. I asked him to talk to the nation to tell him to stop this. This is not who we are.
In a statement, McCarthy said that the House committee wants to interview him about public statements that have been shared with the world. He goes on to say that he has, quote, nothing else to add. Nikole Killion is on Capitol Hill following the latest developments on this story. I would think he's got plenty to add, actually. He spoke to the president leading up to January 6th. You visited him afterwards. Nikole, why won't Kevin McCarthy cooperate with this committee?
Well, the argument that Leader McCarthy is making is that he's already spoken publicly about this before, and so, you know, his statements, in his view, are on the record, and then he alleges that the committee wants to find out more about private conversations that he had with the president that he doesn't believe pertains to what happened on January 6th. So that is, in essence, his argument. He claims that the panel is not legitimate, their investigation is not legitimate, and has no legislative purpose, and he feels that they in part are trying to go after him and others to try to damage their political opponents. So in his view, this is just a partisan exercise, which is what we've heard from a number of House Republicans, particularly those who have been targeted by this panel.
I wonder, Nikole and Anne-Marie, what former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton might have said if she had been asked about appearing before those Benghazi hearings that Republicans called back in 2015, that it was just a partisan exercise. As we all know, she did ultimately appear before those committee to answer their questions. Let me ask you about this. On the day of the insurrection after January 6th, McCarthy went to see former President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. What do we know about that meeting and how his views from that day evolved? He was very vocal in calling it wrong in the hours after the insurrection, but then he goes to Mar-a-Lago and comes back with a different story.
Yeah, and just to note your first point, I mean, I would note that McCarthy has kind of, you know, waffled a little bit as far as how he would deal with this committee. You know, back in the spring, he said, sure, he'd be willing to testify or potentially appear before the panel. Since then, you know, his responses have been more mixed. And again, more recently, he's just said that at this point, he's kind of put it out there and doesn't have anything further to add. So that is his latest view as far as the committee is concerned. You know, with respect to the Mar-a-Lago meeting, actually, the committee does want to kind of get at that. You know, at the time, Leader McCarthy had said that, you know, this was mostly about meeting with the former president, talking about the upcoming midterms. Of course, now we're in the midterm election year, but you know, the committee says it doesn't want to necessarily dive into those details, but it does want to get at, to your point, you know, what changed with respect to his perspective and whether or not he was pressured by the former president or his aides to kind of change his position. Because you'll recall in the days after January 6th, even in that phone call that you heard with Norah O'Donnell, clearly he wanted the violence to stop, and he was encouraging the president to make a statement about this. And that is a narrative that we have heard among many people as a result of the committee's investigation, that there were numerous people trying to reach out to the White House and the president urging him to stop. And again, in the days after the attack, Leader McCarthy condemned what the former president and said that he bears responsibility. And then there was that meeting at Mar-a-Lago, and then that kind of language, you know, went away, if you will. And, you know, since then, the leader has been quite supportive of the former president and his agenda. Now, the leader certainly continues to maintain that what happened on January 6th was lawless. And shouldn't have happened, but there was a notable change in tone, and again, the committee wants to figure out why that happened, and again, whether or not the former president was involved in that.
All right, another big issue, of course, voting rights. We've been talking about that over the last couple of days. Congressional Democrats are proposing sort of a complicated plan to move their agenda forward. And what it sounds to me like is taking the two big bills that are out there, H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and mashing them together. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, so actually the bills under consideration is for the PEOPLE Act, which is a different version of that H.R. 1. It's kind of a scaled down version that would, for instance, make Election Day a national holiday. It would ban partisan gerrymandering, among other things. And so that particular piece of legislation, which has some buy-in from Joe Manchin, is, to your point, being merged with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are measures that the House has supported, and in the Senate, what they're doing is kind of moving these pieces of legislation over from the House to the Senate. They're using this kind of procedural move where they're using another bill, like a shell bill. I know this is really getting into the weeds, but to combine these pieces of legislation to give it to the Senate. But what's significant about this and why they're doing it in this fashion is because it then allows the Senate to actually debate the bills. Because what has happened in the past, for instance, with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I mean, it's one of those things where the bill has cleared the House, and previously with that H.R. 1, that initial voting rights bill, when that got sent over to the Senate, what Senate Democrats argue is that they were never actually able to have a debate on the legislation because of all these procedural steps and being blocked by Republicans to even get to a debate. So by using this mechanism and having these two pieces of legislation merged, sent over from the House, they can take it up as a message. And so in doing that, that allows them to instantly start debate on the legislation. They don't have to actually vote on whether they want to start debate on it, if that makes sense. And so that is really what Democrats have been calling for. Just let us debate the bill. Just let us have an up or down vote on these pieces of legislation. So that's kind of where they're trying to get at. And so that is what we expect to happen over the next couple of days. The House is going to vote on that shell package, which encompasses those two voting rights bills at some point today. They'll send it over to the Senate. The Senate will consider it over the next couple of days. And as Leader Schumer said, if in fact Republicans do object again, then that is where you will see Senate Democrats try to take up these rules changes, potentially to the filibuster.
All right. So how confident are Democrats that this will work, Nikole?
Well, that's the big question, Vlad. I mean, look, they're kind of, balls to the wall with this, if you will. They really want to try to do something. They have to take some kind of action because they know that this is important to their base. So whether or not it works remains to be seen, but they feel they have to move the ball forward on this. And so that is their hope. But at this point, it seems unlikely that they're going to get buy-in from 10 Republicans to support either pieces of this voting rights legislation. And then furthermore, and when it comes to these potential rules changes, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have made clear that they don't want to abolish the filibuster. And while they may be open to some rules changes, it's not really clear if there's a consensus on exactly how to change the rules. So that is kind of the deadlock that Democrats are in right now. But, again, broadly speaking, party officials remain hopeful. And at the end of the day, it's really incumbent on them to at least try to show their base, hey, we're trying to make this a priority. We're trying to get it done. Whether or not it happens again remains to be seen.
So President Biden's actually going to be taking a visit to Capitol Hill today. What's the message he's going to want to give to lawmakers?
Well, I think it's going to be to do some more arm twisting. We've seen this time and again, particularly, for instance, with his Build Back Better agenda, where he's had to come up here and really, rally Democrats to back his agenda and kind of remind them that they're all on the same team and they need to support one another. And so I think, the president is likely to echo a similar message. We heard that very forceful speech from him in Atlanta earlier this week, saying that he is tired of being quiet. He's been talking to these lawmakers for months now, and it's time to act. And so I think he will try to instill that sense of urgency to members, whether or not he pulls aside Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, and is able to twist their arms a little bit more, again, is to be determined. But certainly there will be a full-throated effort on the part of the president and the White House, as we've seen throughout the week, to try to prod Democrats to get on the same page with us.
All right, we'll be watching. Nikole Killion, as always, we thank you.
You bet.